Today we're going to solve quadratic equations by factoring. A quadratic equation is something that has an x squared in it. So this is a quadratic. We haven't solved these types of equations yet. We have solved equations like number 1, and these are linear equations because the x is not squared. So let's review how to solve an equation like number 1. We are going to isolate the variable, which means we need to add 8 to both sides. We get 2x equals 12, and then we need to divide by 2 on both sides, so you get x equals 6. This is a solution to our equation. When you have a quadratic and the x is squared, you can't use this same process. We have to use some of the things we've been doing over the last couple days and couple weeks. So down here, these are our rules for solving quadratic equations by factoring. The first thing you have to do is you have to rewrite your equation in standard form, which means your leading coefficient, which is the x squared term, is positive. So the leading coefficient is the x squared term. And you have to set it equal to 0. So you can't start solving quadratic equations until it's set equal to 0. This is super important. After you have it set equal to 0 and your x squared term is positive, you're going to go to step 2 and factor it completely. That's the stuff you reviewed in the assignment that we did the last e-learning day and that we did before spring break. Then we're going to set each factor equal to 0 so we can get some answers to solve the little equation that we end up with. The little equation that we end up with will be similar to what we just did on number 1. Remember, as you guys are taking these notes, you can stop me, you can pause me, you can rewind me, you can fast forward me. Please don't delete me to catch up and make sure that you are writing everything down and understanding it. All right, so step 1, rewrite in standard form. You have to make sure the leading coefficient is positive, and it is, and you have to make sure that it's set equal to 0. So step 1 is done. Step 2 is factor completely. So we are going to look at our first term, which is x squared, and we're going to break it up into our two parentheses, x and x. We're going to look at our last term, which is negative 56, and we have to figure out what will add to give us negative 10. Hang on, I'm doing this backwards. Multiply to get us negative 56, but add to get us negative 10. I think I'm still doing this backwards. Multiply to give us negative 56, but add to give us negative 10 is how I made the chart before we left for break. So, negative 56 could be negative 8 and positive 7, but that adds to give us negative 1, so that one doesn't work. It could be positive 8 and negative 7, but that adds to give us positive 1, so that one's not going to work. So those are out. So now you might have to start dividing. 56 divided by 2, 56 divided by 3, 56 divided by 4. If you use negative 14 and positive 4, that adds to give you negative 10, so this is the one that's going to work. So again, because the last term's negative, your signs are going to be different, and the 14 needs to be negative and the 4 needs to be positive, and this equation is still set equal to 0. You can do a quick check of your smiles. You would get a positive 4x here, and you'd get a negative 14x here, and when you add those together, that gives you the negative 10x in the middle. You're constantly checking your smiles. Once you get your smiles to work, you need to set each factor equal to 0, and solve for x individually. So you're going to end up with two answers on these. On the first equation, we need to subtract 4 from both sides. So you get x equals -4. That's one answer. And then on the next one, we're going to add 14 to both sides. So we get x equals 14. So after you factor, this is just taking it one more step to set each factor equal to 0 so you can solve to get your answers. On number 2, it's a little bit harder because there's a 3 in front of the x squared, which means when you start to factor, you're not going to be able to make a chart. Remember, you need to make sure that your equation is set equal to 0, which it is, before you start factoring. So when you factor this, 3x squared is going to split up 3x and 1x. You don't have to put the 1 with the x. And then the factors of 5 are going to be 1 and 5. The last term's positive, so the signs are going to be the same, and the middle term's positive, so these are both going to be positive. You can use that chart that you had on your notes that I gave you last time to help you with the signs. We do need to check our smiles to make sure we got this right. 1 times 1 is 1x, and 3x times 5 is 15x. When we add those together, we do get the 16x in the middle. So we know we're right, which means we can go on and find our answer. So we're going to set the first factor equal to 0 and the second factor equal to 0. Remember, when you have 1x, that's the same thing as just writing x. So now we subtract 1 from both sides. So we get 3x equals -1, and we divide by 3. So we're going to get x equals -1/3. And then over here, we're going to subtract 5 and get x equals -5. You have two answers because your x is squared in this problem. Whenever x is squared, you're always going to get two answers. On example number 5, you can see right here that it needs to be equal to 0. So you're going to have to start by subtracting 40. But when you do that, there's no other term that just is a number. The 5 has an x squared with it. The -10 has an x with it. So we do not have like terms, which means we just have to write each one of them by themselves in descending order. Now, part of the rules of factoring is factor out a common factor. All of these are divisible by 5. So we can take a 5 out, which leaves us with x squared minus 2x minus 8 equals 0. We only have to worry about where the x's are located, so the 5 we don't have to worry about in this problem. It doesn't have an x, it just kind of goes away. It still is going to be a part of our factor, but it's not going to be a part of our answer. So now when you're looking at this, we want to factor x squared minus 2x minus 8. It factors. Sorry guys, I had an interruption with my 8-year-old. So I'm going to start number 5 over. You have to subtract 40 from both sides. You're left with 5x squared minus 10x minus 40 equals 0. Remember, you have to have it equal to 0 before you can start. Now, we can factor a 5 out of here, which leaves us with x squared minus 2x minus 8. Since the 5 doesn't have an x with it, we can ignore it, and we can factor x squared minus 2x minus 8. Looking at the x squared and the -8, x squared splits up x and x. The last term is negative, so the signs are going to be different. And here we want to multiply to give you -8, but add to give you -2. So that's going to be -4 and +2. If you do a quick check of your smiles, then I'm going to show you this up here because I'm running out of room. If If you do a quick check of your smiles, you get a 2x here, a negative 4x here, and that equals the negative 2x that we have in the middle right here. So this is working. Once you get it to this point, you can set each factor equal to 0 and solve for x. So you'd subtract 2 from both sides and you'd get x equals negative 2. And you'd add 4 to both sides and you'd get x equals 4. On number 6, again, it's already set equal to 0, but we can factor out a GCF. And I believe all of these are divisible by 2, and since they all have an x with them, we can take out that x. So our GCF is 2x. And when we divide each term by 2x, that leaves us with x squared minus 5x minus 6. Now, this is different than number 5 because this term right here has an x with it, so we need to set it equal to 0 and solve for x by dividing both sides by 2, and 0 divided by 2 is 0. Since our original problem was a 2x to the third power, that means we need to have 3 answers. So we're going to get 2 of our answers from factoring. And remember, when we factor, we look at the first term and the last term. The last term's negative, so when we factor, our signs are going to be different. This 2x is still on the outside, but I already told you what we do with that, so I'm not going to do anything with it from here on out. I need to know what multiplies to give me negative 6, but adds to give me negative 5. Remember, my signs are different, so I have to use a negative 6 and a positive 1. When I do that, that gives me a 1x and a negative 6x, which equals the negative 5x that we want in the middle. Once you get the factor, you set each factor equal to 0, and you solve for x. So we get x equals negative 1. We're going to add 6 to both sides here and get x equals 6. I'm going faster in these videos, but I expect you guys to pause the video and make sure that you keep up with what I'm saying and doing. In example 7, we're going to have to get it equal to 0 before we start. So I'm going to subtract the 2x squared from both sides. So that gives me 5x squared minus 5x equals negative 30x. Don't forget your signs. Now I need to add 30x to both sides because I have to make sure that this is equal to 0 before I start any factoring. So I have 5x squared plus 25x equals 0. On this particular problem, I can factor out a GCF. These are both divisible by 5 and x. That's their common factor. So I can factor out a 5x, which leaves me with x plus 5 equals 0. This is not a quadratic. A quadratic means there's an x squared. This is already factored, so I'm going to take each factor and I'm going to set it equal to 0 and go ahead and solve and find my answers. If I divide both sides by 5 here, I get x equals 0. And if I subtract 5 here, I get x equals negative 5. In number 6, I got 1, 2, 3 answers because my original problem started out x cubed. In number 7, I only got 2 answers, one answer here and one answer here, because my highest power was an x squared. So if your highest power is a 2, you should get 2 answers. If your highest power is a 3, you're going to get 3 answers. Last but not least, number 8, I'm going to start out by subtracting 2x cubed. I'm going to combine like terms and get 4x cubed minus 100x equals 0. My GCF is 4 and x. They're both divisible by 4, and they both have an x term. The 4x, which is my GCF, goes outside the parentheses, and when I do my dividing, 4x cubed divided by 4x is x squared, minus 100x divided by 4x is 25. Now remember, my highest power is a 3, so I need to get 3 answers. Even though this right here only has 2 terms, it is a quadratic because it has an x squared. So we need to factor this using our rules for a perfect square, difference of 2 perfect squares. There's a minus, so they're having their good times and bad times. We can split them up into x plus 5 and x minus 5. Now I'm going to take each factor and set it equal to 0 and solve for x. I'm going to divide by 4 here, and I get x equals 0 for one answer. I'm going to subtract 5 here and get x equals negative 5 for a second answer. And I'm going to add 5 here and get x equals positive 5 for a third answer. Remember, set them equal to 0 and factor. Make sure that you are pausing the video so that you can actually write everything down and understand it. If you have any questions, make sure you give me an email.